Welcome to a fireside reading of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 57, Part 2. What I chiefly hope, my dear Mr. Copperfield, said Mrs. Micawber, is that in some branches of our family we may live again in the old country. Do not frown, Micawber. I do not now refer to my own family, but to our children's children. However vigorous the sapling, said Mrs. Micawber, shaking her head, I cannot forget the parent tree. And when our race attains to eminence and fortune, I should wish that fortune to flow into the coffers of Britannia. My dear, said Mr. Micawber, Britannia must take her chance. I am bound to say that she has never done much for me, and that I have no particular wish upon the subject. Micawber, returned Mrs. Micawber, there you are wrong. You are going out, Micawber, to this distant clime to strengthen, not to weaken, the connection between yourself and Albion. The connection in question, my love, rejoined Mr. Micawber, has not laid me, I repeat, under that load of personal obligation that I am at all sensitive as to the formation of another connection. Micawber, returned Mrs. Micawber, there I again say you are wrong. You do not know your power, Micawber. It is that which will strengthen, even in this step you are about to take, the connection between yourself and Albion. Mr. Micawber sat in his elbow chair with his eyebrows raised, half receiving and half repudiating Mrs. Micawber's views, as they were stated, but very sensible of their foresight. My dear Mr. Copperfield, said Mrs. Micawber, I wish Mr. Micawber to feel his position. It appears to me highly important that Mr. Micawber should, from the hour of his embarkation, feel his position. Your old knowledge of me, my dear Mr. Copperfield, will have told you that I have not the sanguine disposition of Mr. Micawber. My disposition is, if I may say so, eminently practical. I know that this is a long voyage. I know that it will involve many privations and inconveniences. I cannot shut my eyes to those facts. But I also know what Mr. Micawber is. I know the latent power of Mr. Micawber, and therefore I consider it vitally important that Mr. Micawber should feel his position. My love, he observed, perhaps you will allow me to remark that it is barely possible that I do feel my position at the present moment. I think not, Micawber, she rejoined, not fully. My dear Mr. Copperfield, Mr. Micawber is not a common case. Mr. Micawber is going to a distant country expressly in order that he may be fully understood and appreciated for the first time. I wish Mr. Micawber to take his stand upon that vessel's prow and firmly say, This country I am come to conquer. Have you honours? Have you riches? Have you posts of profitable pecuniary emolument? Let them be brought forward. They are mine. Mr. Micawber, glancing at us all, seemed to think there was a good deal in this idea. I wish Mr. Micawber, if I may make myself understood, said Mrs. Micawber in her argumentative tone, to be the Caesar of his own fortunes. That, my dear Mr. Copperfield, appears to me to be his true position. From the first moment of this voyage, I wish Mr. Micawber to stand upon that vessel's prow and say, 'Enough of delay, enough of disappointment, enough of limited means. That was in the old country. This is the new. Produce your reparation. Bring it forward.'" Mr. Micawber folded his arms in a resolute manner, as if he were then stationed on the figurehead. "And doing that," said Mrs. Micawber, feeling his position, "am I not right in saying that Mr. Micawber will strengthen and not weaken his connection with Britain? An important public character arising in that hemisphere, shall I be told that its influence will not be felt at home? Can I be so weak as to imagine that Mr. Micawber, wielding the rod of talent and of power in Australia, will be nothing in England? I am but a woman, but I should be unworthy of myself and of my papa if I were guilty of such absurd weakness." Mrs. Micawber's conviction that her arguments were unanswerable gave a moral elevation to her tone which I think I had never heard in it before. "And therefore it is," said Mrs. Micawber, "that I the more wish that at a future period we may live again on the parent soil. Mr. Micawber may be, I cannot disguise from myself that the probability is Mr. Micawber will be, a page of history, but he ought then to be represented in the country which gave him birth and did not give him employment." "My love," observed Mr. Micawber, "it is impossible for me not to be touched by your affection. I am always willing to defer to your good sense. What will be, will be. Heaven forbid that I should grudge my native country any portion of the wealth that may be accumulated by our descendants." "That's well," said my aunt, nodding towards Mr. Peggotty, "and I drink my love to you all, and every blessing and success attend you." Mr. Peggotty put down the two children he had been nursing, one on each knee, to join Mr. and Mrs. Micawber in drinking to all of us in return. And when he and the Micawbers cordially shook hands as comrades, and his brown face brightened with a smile, I felt that he would make his way, establish a good name, and be beloved, go where he would. Even the children were instructed each to dip a wooden spoon into Mr. Micawber's pot and pledge us in its contents. When this was done, my aunt and Agnes rose and parted from the emigrants. It was a sorrowful farewell. They were all crying. The children hung about Agnes to the last, and we left poor Mrs. Micawber in a very distressed condition, sobbing and weeping by a dim candle that must have made the room look from the river like a miserable lighthouse. I went down again next morning to see that they were away. They had departed in a boat as early as 5 o'clock. It was a wonderful instance to me of the gap such partings make, that although my association of them with the tumble-down public house and the wooden stairs dated only from last night, both seemed dreary and deserted now that they were gone. In the afternoon of the next day, my old nurse and I went down to Gravesend. We found the ship in the river, surrounded by a crowd of boats, a favourable wind blowing, the signal for sailing at her masthead. I hired a boat directly, and we put off to her, and getting through the little vortex of confusion of which she was the center, went on board. Mr. Peggotty was waiting for us on deck. He told me that Mr. Micawber had just now been arrested again, and for the last time, at the suit of Heap, and that in compliance with a request I had made to him, he had paid the money which I repaid him. He then took us down below decks, and there any lingering fears I had of his having heard any rumors of what had happened were dispelled by Mr. Micawber's coming out of the gloom, taking his arm with an air of friendship and protection, and telling me that they had scarcely been asunder for a moment since the night before last. It was such a strange scene to me, and so confined and dark, that at first I could make out hardly anything, but by degrees it cleared as my eyes became more accustomed to the gloom, and I seemed to stand in a picture by Ostade, among the great beams, bulks, and ring-bolts of the ship, and the emigrant berths and chests and bundles and barrels and heaps of miscellaneous baggage, lighted up here and there by dangling lanterns, and elsewhere by the yellow daylight straying down a windsill or a hatchway, were crowded groups of people, making new friendships, taking leave of one another, talking, laughing, crying, eating, and drinking. Some already settled down into the possession of their few feet of space, with their little households arranged and tiny children established on stools or in dwarf elbow chairs, others despairing of a resting place and wandering disconsolately, from babies who had but a week or two of life behind them, to crooked old men and women who seemed to have but a week or two of life before them, and from ploughmen bodily carrying out soil of England on their boots, to smiths taking away samples of its soot and smoke upon their skins. Every age and occupation appeared to be crammed into the narrow compass of the 'tween decks. As my eye glanced round this place, I thought I saw sitting by an open port, with one of the Micawber children near her, a figure like Emily's. It first attracted my attention by another figure parting from it with a kiss, and as it glided calmly away through the disorder, reminding me of Agnes. But in the rapid motion and confusion, and in the unsettlement of my own thoughts, I lost it again, and only knew that the time was come when all visitors were being warned to leave the ship, that my nurse was crying on a chest beside me, and that Mrs. Gummidge, assisted by some younger, stooping woman in black, was busily arranging Mr. Peggotty's goods. "Is there any last word, Master Davy?" said he. "Is there any other forgotten thing afore we parts?" "One thing," said I. "Martha." He touched the younger woman I have mentioned on the shoulder. And Martha stood before me. "Heaven bless you, you good man," cried I. "You take her with you." She answered for him with a burst of tears. I could speak no more at that time, but I wrung his hand. And if ever I have loved and honored any man, I loved and honored that man in my soul. The ship was clearing fast of strangers. The greatest trial that I had remained. I told him what the noble spirit that was gone had given me in charge to say at parting. It moved him deeply. But when he charged me in return with many messages of affection and regret for those deaf ears, he moved me more. The time was come. I embraced him, took my weeping nurse upon my arm, and hurried away. On deck, I took leave of poor Mrs. Micawber. She was looking distractedly about for her family even then, and her last words to me were that she never would desert Mr. Micawber. We went over the side into our boat and lay at a little distance to see the ship wafted on her course. It was then calm, radiant sunset. She lay between us and the red light, and every taper line and spar was visible against the glow. A sight at once so beautiful, so mournful, and so hopeful as the glorious ship lying still on the flushed water, with all the life on board her crowded at the bulwarks, and there clustering for a moment, bare-headed and silent, I never saw. Silent only for a moment, as the sails rose to the wind and the ship began to move. There broke from all the boats 3 resounding cheers, which those on board took up and echoed back, and which were echoed and re-echoed. My heart burst out when I heard the sound, and beheld the waving of hats and handkerchiefs, and then I saw her. Then I saw her at her uncle's side, and trembling on his shoulder. He pointed to us with an eager hand, and she saw us and waved her last goodbye to me. I, Emily, beautiful and drooping, cling to him with the utmost trust of thy bruised heart, for he has clung to thee with all the might of his great love. Surrounded by the rosy light, and standing high upon the deck apart together, she clinging to him and he holding her, they solemnly passed away. The night had fallen on the Kentish hills when we were rowed ashore, and fallen darkly upon me. Thank you all for joining me. More tomorrow, same time and place at 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram, live. And all the chapters uploaded to the YouTube channel Fireside Reading. I hope you're enjoying the end of this book. I certainly am. Luckily, Dickens wraps everything up very much with a bow, so we have a lot of fun things to experience. I loved today. I hope you did too. Until I see you all tomorrow, please stay very well. Good night.